What is your language responsibility? What is your language responsibility? Now, it's an interesting question, especially if you travel, but we're going to bring it back to leadership in a moment. If you're traveling, let's say you go to Italy, my guess is you will not likely, if you're from the US, it's not likely that you will learn Italian. If you're going to Spain or Mexico, it's unlikely that you would learn Spanish. If you're going to Germany, it's frankly unlikely that you would learn German. And part of that is because the reality in the world is there's a lot of English speaking people in the country, in the world. Most countries, English is a language that everyone learns. So that because it's become, I guess, one of the power languages, so you can travel without knowing the language of the area you're in. What's interesting is when I travel, especially internationally, people apologize to me for not being better with their English. I find that silly. In fact, I usually tell them I should be apologizing to you because I didn't take the time and energy to learn your language. I'm coming to your country. And that's kind of a different story about the nature of English in the world as a language. But my point is, if you knew, if you knew, and I'm also going to say we're willing to know that someone spoke a different language, and especially if you are in a role of leadership related to that person, I would say that you have a responsibility to learn the language so that you can communicate effectively with that other person. Now, you may be saying, well, that's a big burden if it's learning a different language. And perhaps it is, but let's think about it a little differently than an actual language. Let's think about learning styles. Let's think about personality profiles. Certain people receive and process information differently. I do it differently than some people. Some people do it differently than me. And I'm not saying that every person is completely an individual we've got to figure out how to tailor our communication to every single person. But wouldn't you agree that there's some level of responsibility as a leader to actually enhance, if not assure, that the information is effectively received by the receiver? Because that's a question about communication. In one of my books, I wrote about this idea of other focused communication, where my commitment is to make sure that the other person gets the intended communication. Not that I communicate in a way that works for me, because I know what works for me. I know how I talk. I know how I think. I know how I use words. I'm pretty sure that when I communicate, it feels good and complete to me, but it may not be complete for the other person and often isn't. And that's the source of our communication gaps or our failures. Some time ago, someone who was in a teaching profession said to me that their responsibility is to teach, their students' responsibility is to learn. And I get that in the sense of students need to take responsibility for their own learning, not to necessarily do it on their own, but it is up to them how much they engage and how much they are committed to learning. And the same would be true of the people that we lead. But I think there's a miss in that statement because I equate it to different languages. If I'm teaching in a way that my students or my team members don't relate to, then am I really effectively teaching? And is it really their responsibility to learn, even if I'm teaching in a way that doesn't align for them? At a minimum, can't we agree that there's a mutual responsibility around learning and growth and communication? That's what I want you to think about. You are probably feeling like your communication is always clear, and it doesn't always turn out that way. Take a look at your communication, what you're communicating, how you're communicating, the mode of communication, all the things that impact the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of that communication. Because after all, if you're speaking English to a team of German speakers, I think you failed as that leader. At least that's what I'd say. Bye for now.